not beat these charges. And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into the icebox and sit for a long time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm your host, Libby Casey, and I am here in our studio with
James Hohmann,
columnist, also
Devlin Barrett,
and Perry Stein. And Devlin and Perry are co-authors of the Trump Trials newsletter, which you can subscribe to by going to WashingtonPost.com. It comes out every Sunday. Devlin, how do you tell people the best way to find it and subscribe to it?
I usually tell people just Google Trump Trials newsletter Washington Post. It pops right up. It's a click, and then you're there.
I Googled Devlin and Perry earlier today to catch the latest episode. You can also, of course, catch us every Thursday. That's when we record Sidebar. And you can listen to us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find us on YouTube. We're also visual, so you can watch us there. Just look for the Washington Post on YouTube and subscribe there. Okay, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, Florida, Washington, D.C., all the locations where there are cases against Donald Trump. But only one has gone to trial so far, and it's very unlikely, would you say impossible, James, that any more will go forward before the election?
Unlikely, not impossible necessarily. We'll see what the Supreme Court rules in terms of how much they narrow the D.C. charges. I'd be shocked if anything happened in Georgia before the election in terms of Trump actually being on trial, but
we're going to go through all of that and get a roundup from Perry and Devlin, who've been following each of the cases in Georgia, Florida, and the federal case in Washington, D.C. to get a sense of where those are at and what the process is doing right now. We'll also today talk about what's up with Trump's sentencing in New York and how Donald Trump plans to spend his summer and whether or not the sentencing could have any say in that. Also, why he's in Washington, D.C. today. We're taping this on Thursday, June 13th. Let's start there, James. Donald Trump made his first trip to Washington today since he became a felon. Let's talk about who he's meeting with and what his message is.
Well, he also made his first trip to Capitol Hill since January 6th, 2021.
Wow, I hadn't put that together.
And so he had 3 meetings this morning. He met with the Business Roundtable, basically a group of the biggest CEOs in the country, privately to talk about sort of what his business agenda would be, tax cuts, that kind of thing. Then he went over to the Capitol Hill Club on the House side to meet with the House GOP conference. Then he went to the National Republican Senatorial Committee office on the Senate side, right by Union Station, met with Senate Republicans, got sort of a very, very warm welcome. Probably less so from the CEOs, although they're warm. A majority of them probably ultimately voting for Joe Biden, but hoping to benefit from Trump policies. But House Republicans, he has very much consolidated support. They gave him actually the game ball from the congressional baseball game that happened last night. Republicans ended up winning. I think the final score was 31-11. It was a rout. So everyone was feeling good. And they sang happy birthday to Trump. His birthday is tomorrow. And it was a very sort of friendly meeting. Trump riffed quite a bit. His aides had told reporters ahead of time that he was going to be very policy specific and talk about his agenda for 2025. But in fact, it was a lot of the same old grievance. He went off on the Justice Department, that kind of thing. But the reception from Republicans was quite warm.
What about the Senate?
The Senate also very warm. It's interesting because Mitch McConnell also hadn't seen Donald Trump since January 6th. This was the first time they were in the same room together. McConnell has said he would support the nominee of the party, even though he doesn't clearly like Trump. It's also noteworthy because there's this race to replace McConnell, who's stepping down as Republican leader at the end of the year. So everyone is basically trying to be in Trump's good graces. You also have this weird dynamic where at least 2 of the people in this room want to be Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance from Ohio, Tim Scott from South Carolina. And J.D. Vance, ahead of Trump's meeting, put out this statement promising to blockade any Biden nominees, to put a hold on everything in protest of Trump being convicted in Manhattan. And that Trump loves that. It's exactly what Trump wants. So anyway, everyone sort of has an incentive to kind of suck up to Trump at this point.
2 weeks from today, June 27th, Trump debates President Joe Biden in Atlanta. This is a CNN hosted debate, but we'll also be broadcasting it and we'll be live, James, around it. What are you going to be listening for in terms of how Trump's conviction comes up as a topic and something that both candidates may have to address.
It will be fascinating. Trump obviously is trying to play it to his advantage. He's trying to use it to rally the base. He's trying to present himself as a victim. It's going to be interesting, the interplay with the Hunter Biden conviction this week in Delaware.
Yeah, and both Devlin and Perry have been covering that. I mean, that certainly will be on the president's mind, President Joe Biden's mind. He's very much been juggling literally global policy and visits with the very personal and private reality of seeing his son convicted on all 3 charges that he was facing related to the gun paperwork that he filled out when he registered to get a gun. Perry, how do you see that factoring into the political landscape right now?
I mean, obviously, Hunter Biden, right? Not a political figure. Trump is, but you do see the Republicans try to make these, make them seem equivalent, and Republicans using this case to try to connect Joe Biden. And I think they'll kind of, now that they have a conviction, maybe continue to try to tie Joe Biden to these legal troubles. But we haven't, they haven't shown any evidence of this. There is no evidence of this, but I think, they'll continue to connect it to the president.
One thing that showed Joe Biden's humanity as a candidate was when he talked about his son who struggled with addiction and basically had that, parental, like, I love my son message. That's a very different approach to these legal troubles than Donald Trump taking this very defensive, like, it's the justice system, it's broken. Can you just explain, Devlin, how the 2 political families have dealt with their critique or acceptance of the justice system?
So I think in some ways there are some similarities, and in some ways there are stark differences. So, for example, one of the things that I think is comically similar about the Hunter Biden legal situation and the Donald Trump legal situation is they have both argued selective prosecution. Now I'm doing it, persecution. So, like, I think it's fascinating that they both basically argue that they're being pursued for political reasons. Hunter Biden's argument is that the Justice Department is so afraid of congressional Republicans that they are charging him with crimes that ordinarily people wouldn't get charged with. Donald Trump's argument is that they are charging me with crimes only to try to prevent me from winning election again. Those are terrible arguments as a general principle within the court system. Judges don't tend to go along with that or agree with that in almost any case. But it does, I think, speak to there is, as different a politician as Trump is, there are some similarities when it comes to a politician facing a criminal case. And that is a very common complaint of politicians who face criminal charges. What's really different, though, is obviously Trump is a candidate. Hunter Biden is not. Trump is attacking the entire system as rigged. Hunter Biden isn't really doing that. He's making a more finely tuned argument. And, at the end of the day, the stakes of the Hunter Biden case may have meaning for his father's chances, but the stakes of the Donald Trump cases are just much larger because, he is the candidate. So there's just a lot more at stake.
And how has Joe Biden responded to the conviction, James?
Well,
of his son.
Yeah, he has said he will not pardon him, but he has declined to rule out commuting his sentence if he's sentenced to jail time. He adjusted his schedule, flew up to Delaware to give him a big hug in public on the tarmac. The thing that actually worries Biden allies more than this case, because it is so related to addiction, and the second Hunter Biden trial will be in September in Los Angeles on tax charges. A lot of the alleged conduct is from after he says he was sober. It also ties into some of his business dealings and how he got his money. There were a lot of deductions of, like, sex club membership, for example, but it also will allow people to sort of highlight what Republicans call Biden Inc. and his working with the Chinese business associates, that kind of thing. That's a lot more politically problematic for Biden than addiction. It's also closer to the election.
And yet you also told us last week on Sidebar that the fact that House Republicans are really pivoting fully, and they have been for a while, but really pivoting into Hunter and other Biden relatives, shows that they've run out of steam in their attempts to try to impeach Joe Biden, President Joe Biden.
Yeah. And so something we'll talk about more in a couple of minutes is the Merrick Garland.
Let's dive in. Let's dive in.
Merrick Garland was held in contempt of Congress on Wednesday. The House passed this resolution. And that also is sort of, it technically what it's over is that Merrick Garland released the transcript of Joe Biden's interview with Robert Hur, the special counsel, but drew the line at releasing the audio of that sit-down interview. And House Republicans say we need to hear the audio. We need to know if it's as bad as Hur suggested.
Because what did Hur say about it, Devlin?
Well, so what Hur raised was the idea that a jury would be so sympathetic to Biden because he's an old man with a poor memory. And obviously that carries a lot of political implications if that assessment is accurate. And I think what Republicans are really trying to do is get one of two things, maybe, and really both if they could, which is get the audio so you could, in theory, cut ads out of it, but also see if there is something in the actual sound of how he answers questions that speak to this notion of a forgetful old man. Look, the Justice Department argument is if you go down this road and start releasing audio for this in non-charged cases, you will make it harder to do investigations in the future in high-profile cases. You will sort of degrade the FBI's ability and the DOJ's ability to pursue tough cases like this. So you should not do this.
And the point I want to make is that the fact that they're going after Garland this way kind of shows the Biden impeachment part of this is basically over. And it's now the sort of new norm where no cabinet secretary had ever been held in contempt. And then Eric Holder, Obama's attorney general, was Bill Barr, Trump's attorney general. Now Merrick Garland. It's not going to actually lead to charges.
I mean, this is really symbolic, right? Explain that, the fact that it won't lead to charges. Like,
so there's a Office of Legal Counsel opinion. Basically, the Biden administration has invoked executive privilege over this. It's something that could be litigated in courts, but Garland isn't going to face actual criminal contempt proceedings.
Right. And the whole point of finding them in contempt is technically what you're doing is you're recommending to the U.S. attorney in Washington, please, we think you should file criminal charges against this person. But you're asking the Justice Department to indict the leader of the Justice Department. Right. That's not really going to happen. And to be honest, to James's point, the whole notion of holding the attorney general in contempt has become a kind of ritual in our sort of dysfunctional Congress now. Of the last 5 attorneys general, 3 of them have been held in contempt. It's not really a mark of any. It's almost more of a mark of distinction than a mark of shame at this point. So I just think it is performative. It is for show largely. And it does speak to, I think, it says more about Congress than it says about the Justice Department.
This week, the Attorney General Merrick Garland had an op-ed in the pages of the Washington Post. Perry, what was his message?
His message was that, keeping what he said a lot, that this is a fair Justice Department. They're not, bending to politics, and that there's been a lot of attacks on the Justice Department. I know Justice Department has been trying to say that this puts our people in danger. And so he defended, meaning FBI agents. Trump specifically has gone after FBI. So he has been, saying what he's saying a lot in the past year, which is a couple of years now, which is that he will, he stands for the Justice Department and its values.
Yeah. And really a warning, which we've heard from him before, but a warning that this could be incredibly incendiary and dangerous. These attacks that go from words to actions.
Yeah, the lead of the op-ed was an example of someone who's just been convicted for threatening federal agents. And Merrick Garland sort of became a public figure with his role after the Oklahoma City bombing in teeing up the case against Timothy McVeigh. And I think this is something that obviously concerns him deeply. And the irony is that the Biden White House detests Merrick Garland. He's persona non grata there. And
why?
Because they just prosecuted his son. And Merrick Garland is the White House feels like Merrick Garland is not a partisan or political figure, that he actually is insulating the independence of the Justice Department. And so the irony is that House Republicans are out there acting as if Merrick Garland is this pliant AG, when the White House view is that Merrick Garland is actually like insulating his department.
I have yet to cover an attorney general who is viewed favorably by their own White House. There is a natural tension between these two things. Now I think it's greater than normal because of all the special counsel investigations. But this is built into the system, this tension. I think what's different now is that you've got criminal cases against the president's son. You've got criminal cases against the former president, current candidate. And so the stakes are higher than they used to be. But this dynamic never goes away. This desire of the White House for the Justice Department to do more for them, or in many cases to do less against them, is constant.
But to that point, what James was saying, I mean, I think we've reported on Merrick Garland a lot. And I think for all extensive purposes, most people that we've spoken to, you know, outside of Congress, regardless of politics, generally think, you know, good guy, good, you know, lawyer, attorney. But the big criticism is that he seems to try to be so apolitical that he kind of does not make the decisive decisions that he needs to make. Now, that's criticism. And I think people have pointed to this Hunter Biden case as an example that he has said, I'm so hands off on it. I don't do anything with this case. But at the same time, this case has dragged on for a long time, even before a special counsel was announced. And so, I mean, I think the criticism on this one is that by not being political, and maybe it was all well-intentioned, but he let it fester to become a very big political thing. And that has probably been the main criticism I've heard from him in Democrat and some Republican circles since, you know, I've been covering this for the last couple of years.
Well, stay with us. We're going to talk about the other cases Trump is facing, but also what is Donald Trump's summer going to be like? He has a lot going on, a lot on his calendar, but he also has sentencing hearing coming up. Stay with us. You're listening to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. Donald Trump met with his probation officer on Monday by video conference. I am not going to lie. Those are words I did not think I'd ever say. Perry, this was done remotely over video, but what is a meeting like this like usually?
I think it's pretty, you know, routine questions like, what's your background? What's your professional history? I guess it gets interesting when your professional history is that you were president of the United States, but, you know, criminal history, things like that. So I don't think it was like, you know, a moment of he tries to show contrition or whatever to get a good sentence. I think it's a pretty routine, emotionless, you know, go through questions.
This is one of those examples of something that's very routine in the criminal justice system, but is so like mind-blowingly not routine, Devlin, because this is the former president as well as a presidential candidate. Right.
And that's why it's unlike, I mean, no probation officer has done an interview like that before in the United States. And to be honest, it does get that those conversations can get into a fair bit of the felon's mindset of like, well, what do you think about what you did? And that is the part that I think is very dangerous for Donald Trump in the run up to the sentencing, because what judges tend to want from defendants is some degree of contrition, some degree of acknowledgement, even after a trial, even after you've fought the case in court, some acknowledgement that they did wrong. He's never going to say that. He's never going to think that or feel that. And I think the real risk he runs in all of this process, because again, the criminal justice system is a great leveler. You stand up when the judge enters, whether you're the president or not. And I think what he actually risks in this part of the process is, I think at the start of this trial, there was a lot of skepticism in the New York legal community that he would have any real risk of jail time. I think as this has gone on between the contempt stuff that Perry and I've written about and issues like this issue of sentencing and contrition, his risk of some sort of real punishment here has risen. Doesn't mean we know what's going to happen. Doesn't mean we know that the judge is going to do that or not. But this is a dangerous area for him. This is a risky area for him because of the way he talks about this case. Sentencing is in some ways the most risky part of this process for him because of the way he talks about the case.
That happens on July 11th. Now, the probation officer meeting that happened Monday isn't something that we are privy to, right? That it's private. It happens between the probation officer and the person who's been convicted in this case, also a lawyer, was able to join. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about sentencing and how that's going to go.
So at sentencing, what normally happens is the probation officer submits a report, says, here's what we think of this person. Here's what we think, here's here's what they said about their case. And then the defense makes an argument. I'm sure that their argument will be for no jail time here. I'm sure their argument will be that, we think we have good issues on appeal, so therefore you must hold off for now on actually making any punishment active. In other words, I think they will argue for a suspended sentence, whatever the sentence is. They'll argue for it to be suspended, meaning held off until the appeals court looks at it. And I think prosecutors will get up and, most prosecutors, most of the time, will argue for some sort of jail sentence. Now, I'm not sure they're going to do that here, but it wouldn't shock me if they did. And ultimately, it's up to the judge. And, a first-time offender on a white-collar case often does not go to jail. But there's nothing about Donald Trump that's normal or ordinary, so the statistics don't really count for much.
And as Devlin mentioned, Perry, this question of contempt has really loomed large because Donald Trump has really breached the guidelines of conduct that the judge had set. And at one point, the judge even lamented that there wasn't like an intermediate level of punishment, right? It was like a minor fine, which is not something that someone as wealthy as Donald Trump would feel, or there's like jail. So he was struggling with that part of this. So how does that factor in to Judge Merchan, who ultimately has the decision over sentencing?
Right. I mean, I think, we've written this before that the more he talks, the riskier it gets, right? I mean, this judge does hold his sentencing fate. So, whether $1,000 means anything to Trump, that's generally the fine that he has received for each, time he's broken his gag order.
Right.
Whether that means much to him. I mean, if he keeps getting this judge mad, violating this gag order, it could, affect him when it comes to sentencing day.
Because it's not over yet. I mean, I think that's something that I wondered about. Like, okay, the trial's over. He's been convicted. What is he still beholden to in terms of his conduct and his speech related to
Right. So, and the
case?
prosecutors have argued that the gag order should remain in effect. And so, I think without the gag order being lifted, you have to assume it's still basically in effect. The other thing to keep in mind, and again, this is the New York court system. Each state has its own court legal system. Given the way that bail reform has worked in New York State generally up till now, it makes it much less likely that he's actually, even if he were to receive some kind of jail sentence from this process, the current practice in New York State makes it much less likely that he would actually have to serve any such sentence until after the appeals were done.
We will be covering the sentencing live on July 11th. James will also be busy just 4 days later because we're going to be at the Republican National Convention, which begins July 15th. Donald Trump hopes to be there as well. Talk to me about that timing, and could his sentencing interfere with the politics of this moment?
Well, I think Trump right now has a political advantage in playing this up and playing up the martyrdom. The RNC seems eager to talk to reporters about planning for this alternative reality where Trump can't make it to the convention. I'd be shocked if that happened. I'd be shocked if
Judge Merchan has really seemed to take into account the reality that Trump's running for president.
And that and the fact that he didn't jail him when he violated the gag order, and Merchan isn't going to want this to be on him, but clearly Trump likes the idea of like, I'm facing this jeopardy and I'm coming, I don't think he likes that he's facing jeopardy. I think he likes the optics and the way that he can sort of spin it. He's going to be in Milwaukee. It's fascinating because normally a presidential candidate would roll out their VP before the convention and you'd get a few news cycles out of that. Trump says, and he can always change his mind, that he's not going to announce his running mate until the convention. So there will be some drama and suspense coming into this convention. There will be drama and suspense around the sentencing. And it is part of a pattern where even today, for example, Donald Trump meeting with some congressional Republicans, wall-to-wall coverage on cable, Joe Biden at the G7 summit in Italy, meeting with foreign leaders, meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, doing a news conference. And there's virtually no public interest or attention to that. And Donald Trump does have this just uncanny ability to suck up all of the political oxygen and all of the media oxygen. Like his meeting today in the grand scheme of things isn't that consequential, but it is something people are genuinely interested in. And he is a showman in that way.
I will say shout out to our colleagues who are covering the G7.
Yes.
A lot of international coverage, a lot of reporters
There's a lot of
working
stories
really
on our
hard.
site.
A lot of our stories on a lot of stories on our site. Go to WashingtonPost.com, find the Washington Post where you read and watch and listen. Stay with us. We're going to talk about what's going on in the other cases and how slowly some of them are moving. You're listening to the Trump Trials Sidebar. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm with Devlin, Barrett, Perry Stein, and James Hohmann. And we are going to dive in now to the other cases Donald Trump is facing. Any guesses on what could come soonest?
Well, we're going to have a bunch of hearings in Florida, and then, we should probably have a Supreme Court decision in the D.C. case around the 2020 election. Those are the two things that are, rolling down the pike right now.
Okay, let me go in reverse order and
Sure.
talk about the one that we were sort of most anticipating in some ways, the case in Georgia, because it is one that Donald Trump has no control over, right? It's not a federal case. So even if he is elected president, he can't do anything about it. It's also one that would be televised, which would give people a true sense of what's happening behind closed doors, so to speak, in a very transparent and open way. It is on delay. Devlin, what's happening?
In the Georgia case, the defense tried to get the district attorney, Fani Willis, thrown off the case because of her relationship with Nathan Wade, who had been working for her on the case. The judge rejected that effort by the defense, but did so in a way that sort of opened the door to an appeal. And so now there is an appeal, and the state appeals court has basically frozen the entire thing until they can look at that issue. But their timeline means that essentially the earliest they would make that decision is the end of this year, meaning certainly after the election. It's not good for the case or the prosecutor that the appeals court is willing to take this up right away, but we don't ultimately know what they're going to do with it. And so it's just sort of frozen in place.
It's pretty incredible. So Nathan Wade, who you'd mentioned, Devlin, who was hired by Fani Willis, they've admitted to having a personal relationship, but they were very defensive about when it started and sort of what would have been the parameters of the timeline of appropriate versus inappropriate, given how she hired him to run this case.
The accusation, the original accusation from the defense side was that romantic relationship began before she hired him. Their argument, trying to push back on these defense claims, is that no, the relationship began after she hired him. So when has always been a key and very contentious point in this whole issue.
Mm-hmm. And also the question of whether she benefited financially because he was
Sure.
paid, right?
Yeah, that is the main argument, right? Is that she's using, she's spending taxpayer money to prosecute this case. She hired someone who she was in a romantic relationship with, using that money to, go to her boyfriend, right? Obviously, they're saying that it started after. And so there was nothing inappropriate, no inappropriate use of taxpayer funds.
So you, dear listener, may be wondering why we're talking about this all over again. But part of it is because this is now on hold as this spins its way through the court. Nathan Wade was on CNN this week, and the anchor, Caitlin Collins, trying to pin him down on the exact timeline of the relationship. And James, it's like he got in his own way. So let's roll the tape, and what you'll hear is Caitlin Collins asking Nathan Wade, and then you're going to hear a big pause as his team tries to do damage control. Let's watch.
When did the romantic relationship between the two of you start?
Yeah, so we get into. There's been this effort to say that okay, these exact dates are at issue, and these exact dates are. I'm getting signaled here.
Okay, so Nathan Wade's media consultant has interrupted him in the middle of the interview. They're having a sidebar huddle right now. They're taking off his microphone.
Yes. Okay.
And as Caitlin Collins and her camera crew wait, Nathan Wade is going into the corner with his consultant, and they're having a private huddle.
Everything okay?
Yeah.
Just to revisit the question, it was to clarify when the romantic relationship started and when it ended.
Sure. So I believe that the public has through the testimony and other interviews, the public has a clear snapshot that this is clearly just a distraction. It is not a relevant issue in this case. And I think that we should be focusing on more of the facts.
Okay, so we cut that down, but it was like over a minute of those two guys off in the corner huddling and trying to do damage control. I mean, what happened?
It's the most confusing part about that exchange to me is it's the most predictable, expectable question that you're going to get in that interview. And he, in that moment, he seems completely unprepared for it. And his people seem to hit the panic button.
Yeah, they panicked.
In that moment too. I mean, look, the defense introduced evidence that they said showed the relationship started before. The judge did not ultimately agree that the defense could prove that case. Although the judge did say that an odor of mendacity hung over the answers he got on some of these questions. Great line from a movie, by the way. So I just think it puts more blood in the water on a particular issue that did not go well for them on the lower court level. And if I were, the DA's office and those offices, I would be very concerned that answer, that whole sequence suggests that there is indeed something there, there.
Trump could not be luckier in his opponents. It really is just breathtaking. During the same interview, the whole interview was a train wreck, not just that one moment. I watched it live on TV. And he showed up at Fani Willis's victory party a few weeks ago when she was reelected in the Democratic primary for DA and was there partying. And he didn't have a good answer on that. And he didn't have a good answer on what their current relationship is. And all of it is just, it is breathtakingly bad judgment. And he talks about this distraction. He's the one who's on TV giving an interview about his relationship with Fani Willis. And it always seems to break in Trump's favor.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely they've succeeded in slowing down this trial and pushing it back after the election with this. So, I think it did play out like this mini trial. It was seemed pretty salacious, like a distraction. But at the end of the day, I mean, they've been successful in using it to slow down the case.
It's true. Let's talk about, let's see. I'm spinning the wheel. Florida. Should we go to Florida?
Sure.
Let's talk about the case in Florida. This is a federal case, but the jurisdiction is Florida.
Right. So this is the case about the classified documents. This is the case that in the Trump legal defense team worries about the most in some ways, because the facts and the law are the most dangerous for Trump, I think, in that case. But it is on a very slow boat, that case, because of the judge in that case, Eileen Cannon, is making a lot of, I think you could also almost call it microjudging. She's taking smaller and smaller issues and spending more and more time on each of them, including holding a series of hearings this month that are going to eat up a lot of clock.
Right,
Perry?
Yeah, she's holding many hearings that I think most judges, I think it's safe to say, would, rule on just without holding a hearing, right? I mean, it's a defendant's job, defense attorney's job to throw everything you can against the wall, often long shot motions. And that is exactly what Trump's defense attorneys have done and his co-defendants. But what Cannon has done, which has, created so many more hearings, also created a backlog of decisions that she has to make before this case can even go to trial, is hold actual hearings on this. So we have, at the end of the month, next Friday and next Monday, there are two separate hearings related to was Jack Smith, that's the special counsel, legally appointed? Was he legally funded? Now, these are kind of dismissal motions that Hunter Biden, similar ones, not the exact arguments, filed in his cases. Trump's filed them before, but never have we had a hearing on it. And she's invited outside people, meaning this has been a theory pushed among, some people in like Heritage Foundation, conservative legal groups, and, saying, this is why Jack Smith was unlawfully appointed. So Trump has taken that argument, and she has invited outside people that are not involved in the case to participate in these hearings. So, I mean, it's a lot of hearings for what I think a lot of lawyers and judges, most even, would consider long shot motions.
Help me understand the story that you guys wrote about her decision to strike a paragraph in the classified documents indictment that relates to the superseding indictment. Help me understand the logic there and how much of an effect this will have.
So I don't think it has a huge effect in and of itself, but I think it's very emblematic of how she has approached this case so far, where she chews on a thing that is not particularly, big or all that important in the case, but she spends a lot of time on it. She ultimately decides mostly in favor of the prosecutor. It's the original premise of what the defense was asking for was to have counts dismissed from the indictment. She doesn't ultimately go along with that. But in the course of making the ruling, she really lodges a bunch of criticisms against the special counsel and basically say the special counsel here is being overzealous, over accusatory, just is being unfair to Trump. And you see that pattern in a lot of her rulings, where she doesn't actually rule on the big merit questions against the special counsel, but she begrudgingly rules in his favor and takes shots at him as she's doing it. Do you think that's...
Yeah, I mean, right, if you had a scorecard of who's been winning most of the motions in this Cannon, case in the class, the prosecutors would win, right? She hasn't dismissed the case. She hasn't done that. But when you look at the question of timing, which is really critical here, I mean, Trump I have to imagine, is doing better than he thought he could have done on this case in terms of timing.
So timing is everything when it comes to the other case that Donald Trump faces here in Washington, D.C., also a federal case over his involvement in January 6th, James, and where the blame falls on that. But we're watching to see how the Supreme Court will rule on presidential immunity. Update us on that.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court is at the end of the term, usually ends end of June, very beginning of July. We had a decision day today. We have another decision day tomorrow. And this is like what Perry's saying, one of those situations where ultimately they're not going to accept, certainly in full, Trump's argument on immunity. They may narrow it. But this has just run down so much clock, and they could end up sort of meaningfully running out more clock by kicking down to the court various questions and creating some general standard that then the court has to wade its way through, and that could be continually litigated. But I expect we'll get a decision in the next 2 or 3 weeks that will then send this back to the DC District Court.
If you're Jack Smith, what do you do at this moment?
Oh, I mean,
go play golf. I mean, I don't know what his hobbies are.
Cases. I mean, the weird thing in Florida, the weird thing is he's quite busy because we have a lot of hearings, regardless of how important they are. We have a lot of hearings to cover and deal with. I think in the DC case, there'll be a decision late June, early July that will almost certainly restart the clock, as lawyers say, on the actual trial. But there are probably at least a month, maybe 2 months of actual pretrial work to do before that happens. And depending on how, to James' point, depending on how they word their decision, they might have to go back and forth up a couple times more to the Supreme Court. The other thing to remember is this is just the thing that stopped it this time. It's not as if the Trump lawyers are going to be like, great, let's go to trial once the clock starts ticking again. The Trump lawyers are going to raise other concerns, other issues. And it's very clear that Judge Chutkan, who is overseeing that trial, wants to get going. At the end of the day, motions are motions and they have to be dealt with. And so I think the way I think of it is, yes, we're likely to see the trial, the trial clock restart, but the trial clock restarting is not the same thing as the trial starting. And so what we're going to go into, I think, is a period of the sort of the pregame contest. And then the pregame contest will begin in earnest, and we still won't know right away does that mean we get a trial in August, September, October, November, December? Like, how far does it go? We just don't know.
And I think, like, Chutkan, what makes her very different from Cannon, right, is that she wants to move fast. And I don't think she cares if this trial starts the day before the election. Like,
Right.
I don't think she's really cares too much about that.
Like her focus is on the law and the case,
Yeah, I think,
not.
well, she's shown everything. She wants to get this case moving
Yeah.
fast.
I also think, from the Justice Department's point of view and the justice system's point of view, the people in the public all talk about Election Day. I think there's a more important date from in the minds of the criminal justice system, which is Inauguration Day.
So January 20th.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you could do a trial between Election Day and Inauguration Day, I'll be honest, I think there's a lot of people within the criminal justice system who would say that's fine. The real drop dead deadline for some of those folks is Inauguration Day, not Election Day.
So
All right. Well, we'll see how it all develops and whether you guys are allowed to go on holiday yourselves. I don't know. I don't know.
Does Florida count? I don't think
Did you
Florida
say does
counts.
Florida
Don't think Florida counts.
Delaware, was that relaxing?
You know, Wilmington.
Yeah.
Wilmington
Some good
was
restaurants,
nicer
yeah.
than I thought. I enjoyed Wilmington. We have pens. We'll travel.
I love it. Pens and notebooks will travel. Devlin, Perry, thank you so much. A reminder to definitely subscribe to their newsletter, The Trump Trials. It continues even as we watch all these twists and turns of the legal process. To find that, go to the Washington Post. Like I said, I just Google you guys and it leads me to it every time. James Hohmann, thank you as well, columnist at the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. You can, of course, find us every Thursday on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube if you want to see in living color the sort of Nathan Wade stumbling, getting pulled off camera. That's where you can experience that in person. We'll see you next Thursday with Sidebar.